Scary telling. I always knew I was different. As a child, my parents noticed that I was not able to speak, even though there was nothing physically wrong with me. I was diagnosed with a rare condition that affects speech development, and instead, I had to learn other ways to communicate. I learned sign language and lip reading, and it became my primary way of communicating with the world. My parents were supportive and loving, but my father was strict and had high expectations for me. One day, when I was around 6 years old, I was misbehaving, and my father knelt down in front of me to discipline me. He looked me straight in the eyes and spoke very slowly, mouthing the words, "If you keep up this behavior, I'll take away your eyes next." I was terrified. My father had never threatened me before, and the way he looked at me made me feel like he was serious. From that day on, I became more obedient, and I made sure not to give him any reason to be angry with me. Years passed, and I grew up to be an independent young adult. I moved out of my parents' house, got a job, and made new friends. But my fear of my father never left me, and I always made sure to stay on his good side. One day, I received a call from my mother telling me that my father had passed away in his sleep. I was shocked and saddened, but also relieved that I would no longer have to live in fear of him. A few days later, I went back to my parents' house to help my mother sort through my father's belongings. As I was going through some old boxes in the attic, I found a dusty old book with a strange title. The title read, "The Eyes of Silence." I opened the book and started reading. The more I read, the more I realized that the book was about a group of people who believed that the eyes were the source of all evil in the world. They believed that by taking away a person's eyes, they could purify them and make them better. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read on, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. As I turned the pages, I found a note that my father had written on the last page of the book. The note read, "My dear child, I know that you can't hear me, but I hope that you can read this. I want you to know that I love you and that I never intended to hurt you." I was a member of a cult that believed in the purification of the soul through the removal of the eyes. I was brainwashed, and I did terrible things to people. But I never touched you. You were always my little angel, and I could never hurt you. Please forgive me. I felt sick to my stomach as I read the note. I couldn't believe that my father was a member of a cult that believed in such heinous acts. I felt violated, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being watched. That's when I looked out the window and saw everyone standing still, looking at my house. They were all staring at me with blank expressions, and I realized that they were all members of the same cult. I tried to run out of the house, but the door was locked. I was trapped, and I knew that I was in danger. That's when I heard a knock on the door. I looked through the peephole and saw a man wearing a black robe and a white mask. He said, "We have come for your eyes. You must purify yourself." I screamed and ran to the back of the house, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped, and I knew that I had to think of something fast. I looked around and saw a piece of broken glass on the ground. I picked it up and held it tightly in my hand, ready to defend myself. The door burst open, and several men in black robes and white masks rushed in. I fought with all my might, slashing at them with the glass, but they were too strong for me. They overpowered me, and before I knew it, everything went dark. When I woke up, I was in a dark room, lying on a cold stone floor. I could feel the pain in my eyes, and I realized that they had done it. They had taken away my eyes. I was alone, in complete darkness, and I didn't know what to do. I cried and screamed for help, but no one came. I was trapped, helpless, and blind. Days turned into weeks, and I was still in the dark room, alone with my thoughts. I tried to remember what it was like to see, but it was a distant memory. My world was now a never-ending darkness. One day, I heard a noise coming from the door. It was faint, but I could hear it. I tried to get up, but my body was weak, and I stumbled. I fell, and when I hit the ground, the door opened. I could see a faint light coming from the door, and I felt a glimmer of hope. I crawled towards the light, and when I reached the door, I looked up and saw a figure standing there. It was my mother. She helped me up and hugged me tightly. She told me that she had been looking for me ever since I went missing. She had found out about my father's involvement in the cult and had been searching for me ever since. She led me out of the room and into the light. It was the first time I had seen the sun in weeks, and it was blinding. But it was a beautiful sight. We left the house and went far away, never looking back. I had lost my eyes, but I had found my freedom. I was no longer trapped in the darkness, and I could finally live my life without fear. But the memory of the cult and what they had done to me would always haunt me. I knew that I would never be the same again, but I was alive, and that was all that mattered. I work as a visual merchandiser for a high-end fashion boutique in the heart of the city. One day, my boss informed me that we would be receiving a shipment of mannequins that needed to be set up in the store's windows. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but little did I know that those mannequins would change my life forever. The day the mannequins arrived, I was tasked with unpacking them and setting them up in the window display. They were delivered in bubble wrap, which I carefully removed, revealing 6 identical figures. As I began to set them up, I noticed that there was something off about them. Their faces were eerily realistic, and their glassy eyes seemed to follow me wherever I went. But I pushed those thoughts aside, assuming it was just my imagination. From the main room, I began to hear popping sounds. At first, I thought it was just the sound of bubble wrap being popped, but the noise grew louder and more persistent. It was as if something was moving inside the mannequins. I decided to investigate, and as I got closer to the mannequins, the popping sounds grew even louder. I could hear something moving and shifting inside them, as if they were alive. Suddenly, one of the mannequins moved. It was just a slight twitch, but it was enough to send shivers down my spine. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, but I knew deep down that something was terribly wrong. That night, I was closing up the store when I heard a noise coming from the window display. It was a low moaning sound, almost like a human voice. I cautiously approached the mannequins, and that's when I saw it. One of them had moved again, this time in a more dramatic way. Its arm was outstretched, as if it were reaching for something. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that these mannequins were more than just lifeless figures. They were something else entirely, something that was beyond my understanding. Over the next few weeks, strange things began to happen in the store. Objects would move on their own, strange whispers could be heard coming from the mannequins, and the air would turn icy cold without warning. I tried to tell my boss about what was happening, but he just brushed it off as my imagination. He didn't believe me until one day when we came in to find that the mannequins had moved on their own. They had somehow managed to break free from their display and were now standing in a circle in the middle of the store. It was then that we realized the true horror of what we were dealing with. The mannequins were not just objects, but they were cursed, possessed by the spirits of the people who had been trapped inside them. We tried to get rid of them, but they kept coming back, no matter what we did. We were trapped, held captive by the very objects that we had brought into our store. In the end, there was only one way to end the curse. We had to destroy the mannequins, shattering them into a million pieces. It was a terrifying ordeal, one that I would never forget. Years have passed since then, and I still have nightmares about the mannequins. They haunt me in my dreams, reminding me of the horrors that I faced. I can only hope that no one else ever has to go through what I did, that no one else ever has to face the terrifying curse of the mannequins. I had just moved into my new apartment, and as I was unpacking my things, I noticed something strange. Every time I walked past the single light bulb in my living room, I would cast two shadows instead of one. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but the more I looked at it, the more I realized that something was off. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my imagination, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I caught a glimpse of something moving out of the corner of my eye. When I turned to look, I saw that one of the shadows was moving on its own, as if it had a life of its own. I was too scared to move, too scared to even breathe, as the shadow continued to move and contort in front of my eyes. It was as if it was trying to tell me something, trying to communicate with me in some way. Over the next few days, things only got worse. The shadow became more aggressive, moving faster and more erratically than before. I tried to tell myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, but deep down, I knew that something was terribly wrong. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a voice whispering in my ear. It was the voice of a woman, soft and gentle, but also filled with a sense of sadness and despair. "Help me," she whispered. "Please, help me." I was too afraid to respond, too afraid to even move, as the voice continued to speak to me. It was as if the shadow was trying to possess me, trying to take over my body and my mind. That's when I decided that enough was enough. I couldn't live like this anymore, haunted by this mysterious shadow that seemed to have a life of its own. I had to find out what was going on, no matter how scary or dangerous it might be. I started to research the history of my apartment building, hoping to find some clues about what was happening to me. What I discovered was more terrifying than I ever could have imagined. Years ago, a woman had been murdered in my apartment, strangled to death by her husband. Her spirit was said to haunt the building, seeking revenge on anyone who crossed her path. I knew then that the shadow I had been seeing was the woman's ghost, trapped between this world and the next, unable to move on until her killer was brought to justice. I decided to confront the ghost, to try and help her find peace. It was a risky move, but I knew it was the only way to end the nightmare that had been haunting me for so long. When I finally saw the shadow again, I took a deep breath and spoke out loud. "I know who you are," I said. "I know what happened to you." The shadow stopped moving, as if it was listening to me. I took a step closer, trying to show it that I meant no harm. "I want to help you," I said. "But you have to let me." There was a long pause, and then, suddenly, the shadow disappeared, leaving me standing alone in the middle of my living room. From that moment on, the two shadows were gone, replaced by a single, solitary figure. I knew then that the ghost had finally found peace, able to move on to the next world knowing that her killer had been found. It was a terrifying experience, one that I would never forget. But I was also grateful, knowing that I had helped a lost soul find the peace that it had been seeking for so long. I wake up, and everything feels wrong. It's too quiet outside. I can't hear the usual sounds of cars passing by, birds chirping, or people going about their day. It's just silence. I sit up and look around my room, but everything appears normal. My clock reads 7 a.m., just like every other weekday. I get out of bed, and as I make my way to the window, I can feel a sense of dread settling in the pit of my stomach. I pull back the curtains and look outside, and that's when I see it. Everyone in my neighborhood is standing still, like statues. They're all looking at my house, and their eyes seem to be trained on me. I try to rationalize it, thinking maybe there's some kind of emergency, or perhaps they're all looking at something behind my house. But deep down, I know that's not the case. The stillness feels intentional, directed towards me. I feel like I'm being watched, and the unease starts to creep over me like a cold blanket. I turn to leave the room, but as I do, I catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror. My reflection is different, and I don't mean just disheveled from sleep. I'm different. My eyes seem to be darker, my skin more sallow, and I look like I haven't slept in days. That's when I notice something else. There are two shadows casting behind me, despite there being only one light bulb in the room. It's like there's something else in the room with me, something I can't see. I try to shake off the feeling and make my way to the front door. I need to see what's going on, to figure out why everyone is standing still. But as soon as I step outside, the stillness engulfs me. The air is thick, and I can feel it pressing against my skin. The grass beneath my feet feels wrong, like it's made of needles. And the sky, it's not blue, it's a sickly shade of green. As I make my way down the street, the statuesque figures start to turn their heads towards me. I can feel their eyes following me, and I can sense their anger, their hunger. I start to run, but the stillness seems to slow me down. It's like I'm running through water, and every step is an effort. I'm not sure how long I run for, but eventually, I reach the edge of the neighborhood. As I turn to look back, I see it. My house, it's changing. The windows are growing larger, and the walls are stretching outwards, like it's expanding. It's like the house is alive, and it's consuming everything around it. I can hear something whispering, calling out to me, and I know I can't go back. I run as fast as I can, away from the stillness, away from the hunger. When I finally stop running, I'm miles away from my neighborhood, and everything seems normal again. The sun is shining, birds are chirping, and people are going about their day. But I know that it's not over, that the stillness is still out there, waiting for me. I can feel its hunger, its anger, and I know that I'll never be truly safe. The stillness will always be with me, watching, waiting, consuming everything in its path. I had always been a fan of radio contests, so when I heard the announcement of a rare opportunity to win something from 911, I couldn't believe my luck. I quickly dialed the number and waited for my turn. It didn't take long before I heard the perky voice declare that I was the fifth caller and the winner. I was ecstatic, but the excitement was short-lived as the operator asked me for my emergency. I paused for a moment, confused. I didn't have an emergency, I had only called for the contest. But I knew I had to come up with something to keep my prize. So I blurted out the first thing that came to my mind: there's someone in my house. I could hear the operator's voice become more serious as she asked for my location and told me to stay on the line. I did as I was told, sitting on the edge of my bed with my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't long before I heard the sirens of the police cars and the screech of the ambulance as they arrived at my house. The police officers quickly entered my home, guns drawn, while the paramedics waited outside. As I stood there, shaking with fear, I realized I had made a huge mistake. I had lied about the emergency and now there were real consequences. But it was too late to turn back now. The police officers searched my entire house, but found nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of a break-in, no footsteps, no one hiding in the closet. It was as if my house was completely empty, except for me and the officers. As they left, I breathed a sigh of relief, glad that the whole ordeal was over. But my relief was short-lived as I heard a strange noise coming from the basement. It sounded like a low growl, but I couldn't be sure. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my imagination. But the noise grew louder and more persistent until it was impossible to ignore. I slowly made my way down to the basement, my heart racing with every step. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw a dark figure lurking in the shadows. It was a man, dressed in all black, his face obscured by a mask. I screamed and tried to run back up the stairs, but he was too quick. He grabbed me by the arm, his grip tight and unforgiving. "I told you to call 911, he growled, his voice low and menacing. "I told you to say there was someone in your house." I couldn't believe it. The whole thing was a setup, a twisted game that I had unwittingly become a part of. The prize I had won was not something to be celebrated, but rather something to be feared. The man dragged me back into the basement, his intentions clear. I was his captive, his plaything. And there was no escape. As I sit here now, in the darkness of the basement, I realized that the prize I had won was not worth it. It had led me down a path of terror and despair, one that I could never escape from. And now, as I await my fate at the hands of my captor, I can only hope that my story serves as a warning to others. The prize of winning something from 911 is not worth the risk. It could lead you down a path of terror and fear, one that you may never escape from. So the next time you hear a radio contest offering a prize from 911, think twice before you call. You never know what you might win.